Welcome everyone to the Academy of the Impossible and our bi-weekly campaign school, which is a program we started to encourage and facilitate participation in the political process. It was partly triggered by some of our students who want to run for public office, but it's also designed for a broad sense of participation. So it includes people who want to be pundits, people who want to work behind the scenes, people who want to treat the political process as a farce and fodder for their own comedy. Certainly we encourage as broad a level of participation as possible, and these campaign schools are both meant as a resource for those of you who have taken the time out on a gorgeous Sunday to come in, but we also record these for YouTube, in that we've been building a resource for people who on the web want to learn from people who have expertise, who have experience in political campaigns. It is a great honor today to have Bill Fox, who's a very good friend of mine, and I would call a friend of the Academy, both past, present, and future tense. Bill's been a kind of a mentor for me in the sense that I've learned quite a bit about politics and communications from Bill, and I think the reverse is true in terms of the internet and technology. So it's Bill is perhaps the first of many guests who I'll bring in who I've learned from and are open enough to also be interested in how our times technologically and politically are changing. And Bill is also our first guest who is not someone who themselves is elected but has worked behind the scenes, in that our three previous guests are all people currently in office and obviously gave a perspective that comes from being under the spotlight. Whereas I suspect Bill will be able to be a little more frank because he's not running for office and does have quite a bit of extensive experience, I think, in all aspects of campaigns, both electoral and non-electoral. And certainly your background as one of a journalist. So I think it's also relevant in that the Academy of the Impossible is essentially a communication school, in that we generally teach people that you can achieve the impossible through effective communication, through being able to articulate what it is that means. And so the format for today will be about a 30-minute conversation between Bill and I, and then we open it up to questions, comments, and other anecdotes from the audience. Now, Bill, I mentioned that you started off your professional career as a journalist, and I do want to spend a bit of time talking about that. But one of the questions we start with most of our guests with is when they became politicized. I mean, what was it that, was there a point in your life that you realized that politics was something that really interested you, that you really wanted to, at the very least, observe, if not actively get engaged in? I mean, I'm curious when that happened in your life, whether it was when you were a young person or when it was you were already a professional and starting your career.
In fact, I don't actually remember politics not being part of my life. Both of my parents were what we would now say, now describe as community activists. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a small city in northern Ontario, mining community. My father was a hard rock miner, but both he and my mother were extraordinarily active in the community, and in those days that tended to manifest itself through participation in service organizations. So that was the era that you now see in a kind of Happy Days sitcoms, but it was the era of the Lions Club, the era of the Kiwanis. There actually were moose, and not just the ones that were in the bush outside our back lot, right? And the religious communities tended to have their organizations, whether it was the Knights of Columbus or the Orange Lodge or however it manifested itself. And so my parents were extraordinary, and both of them. My mother was as every bit as active as my father. My father was a very active liberal. He produced more social democrats in his kids than liberals, to his dismay, but to his intense relief, only one conservative. But it was an absolute staple of conversation at the family dinner table. And I grew up in a mine house. In those days it was a bit like indentured service. Every time your father got a promotion, you moved to another mine house that was a little bigger, maybe a little further up the hill. But in our case, it was a house that was across a dirt lane from the Timmins Daily Press. Mm-hmm. And so that was the second part of it for me. I always was involved around media, the radio station, and the newspaper were housed in the same building. It was actually where Lord Thompson launched the empire, the Timmins Daily Press and CKGB radio. And if in hockey you would describe somebody as a gym rat, then I was a kind of a media rat, because we were always around the paper and we were always hanging around the radio station. We had the good fortune to have a friend whose father was the general manager, so it was hard for them to kick us out. They did ultimately, but there were a few niceties that had to be observed on the way to showing us the door. So it was always part of my world.
Now, you mentioned that your dad was a liberal and that many of your siblings became social democrats. I've heard your story of sort of how you became a Tory. And I think also, too, that many young people may not realize the distinction between a red Tory and the Conservative Party today, which may be worth making. But tell us more about why you chose to become a conservative. Was there a catalyst, or was it just a natural progression in terms of your thinking about politics?
No, in fact, when I saw your notice, I was sort of chuckling to myself when I saw myself described as a conservative, and I thought there are about 8,000 people attending an event in Ottawa this weekend, sponsored by the Manning Institute, almost without exception would take vehement opposition to my being described as a conservative.
It's all relative.
It would be all relative. You know, I don't know that I grew up conscious of a political philosophy. I think I was maybe more of a contrarian. And I think I was, you know, as a reporter, I was always intrigued about if there was a view about something. My instinct was always, well, I wonder what's going on the other side. I wonder if I went over there, what would it look like from there? Latterly, I think I came to a view that, like many Canadians, I was in fact a red Tory. What does that mean? I think it means, you know, a lot of Canadians are very progressive when it comes to social policy, with a tendency to be kind of fiscal conservatives, with a view that because of the twin challenges of geography and population, there is a view for the state around great enterprises. And it's a bit ironic today to have that conversation in the context of conservatism, but you know, it actually was the Conservatives that built the railroads. It actually was a Conservative government that created public broadcasting in the CBC. You know, so I think people always saw a role for government, but people who were not inclined to leave everything to government. People who might agree, if you were to draw up a list of 10 things that they thought that we as a society need to address, there'd probably be unanimity as to what those 10 things are. Where there might be some differences is the calibration of who got assigned what in the job jar. So, and I'll use an individual for illustrative purposes. One of my very good friends is a fellow by the name of Tom Axworthy, who was principal secretary to Mr. Trudeau when Mr. Trudeau was Prime Minister. Tom and I would agree on almost everything in terms of what has to happen. Where we would spar is how much of that job jar should get assigned to government and or the state. And I think as part of my kind of contrarian, I'm always a little leery about big anything. I don't, and you know, my brothers who've been very active in the labor movement will be rolling their eyes at what I'm about to say. But you know, I mean, I'm a bit leery of big government. I'm a bit leery of big labor. I'm a bit leery, you know, I just kind of a contrarian. And one of the things that was a defining experience for me, however, did occur very early in my journalistic career around what we now describe as the October crisis, and more specifically the imposition of the War Measures Act. And that single act by a person whose history up to that point was that of somebody that was a champion of individual rights. That was actually quite a seminal thing for me. And I thought, you know, you got to be really wary of the power of the majority. You have to be really wary of the power of democratic expression, in the sense that it can be used sometimes to suppress the right of the individual. Now, what that meant in practice is that I probably became as vehement a supporter of Mr. Trudeau's Charter of Rights and Freedoms as part of the constitutional patriation process, but we probably got there for different reasons. You know,
Well,
I was a big champion of the Charter because I thought I need that protection against the state.
Well, and it strikes me too that you're almost articulating a journalist's mentality too. That you are, while appreciative of the rights you have as a journalist, very critical of power, very critical of government. And it's interesting that you described, you know, the dinner table as being the primary source of politicization. But I also must assume that being a parliamentary reporter, being a journalist covering politics, must have also given you not just an education, but access to really understanding how politics works in a really raw way that, as a political animal, you must have loved in terms of really feeding that education and feeding that early professional development.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, we were also pretty active politically as well, even when I was a kid. Like, I mean, as a 10 or 11 or 12-year-old, I delivered pamphlets door to door. You know, we used to have a great mayor in Timmins who, with hindsight, I think probably was, you know, as incompetent an office holder as, you know, as the world has ever seen. But I thought he was just this wonderful guy. And I would swing by his office like most days, coming home from school when I was 10 or 11, stick my head in the door, kind of, how are things, what's new, what's happening, you know. And he'd always, you know, he always had time for you. He'd make a little, you know, he'd chat or whatever. And my father had been a candidate at one point for office and was very active in the local riding association. So that was always part of it. Certainly journalism, you know, it's funny. I actually never thought I would be anything in life but a reporter. You know, I mean, I guess when I was really young, I thought I was going to be a high school football coach. But when I started working and got into a newsroom, I never thought I'd be anyplace else in my life. And I never thought I would do anything other than report. But, you know, as, you know, Bob Lewis and Bob Weed and others know who, you know, who are in journalism, one of the ironies of journalism is that at a certain point, the pressures are brought to bear to make you into a manager. And I always kind of wondered about that on two levels. One, I'm not sure the skill set that makes you a good reporter necessarily prepares you to be a news executive. And secondly, what appealed to me about that business was people and and being out and finding out stuff for yourself. And you know, an editor is a very different function. And I was always more attracted to the former than the latter.
And actually, on that note, I mean, I think it might be worth elaborating on what that meant, because I mean, I think journalism today seems rather disconnected from the journalism of your age, in part because of Google.
Yeah.
And the fact that you would now spend so much time sitting at your desk using the computer, whereas you'd have to go out and actually cultivate sources and dig for stories.
Yeah, it's the biggest single change. I mean, I sort of chuckle to myself, you know, I'm one of the world's oldest graduate students, and I sit in classrooms with people and hear professors, learned professors, describe, you know, the golden era of journalism. And it happens to coincide with when I worked in it. I have to tell you, it didn't seem that golden at the time. It seemed something just shy of indentured service. But the one thing that was a fact is that we did cover the news. If you were a correspondent, you know, somewhere, Washington, Ottawa, wherever, you were on the road all of the time. And I can actually give you a stat to back up that assertion, because a friend of mine actually did the research. In 1979, 1980, we had 2 federal elections and a referendum campaign in this country. And a friend of mine calculated that he and I were on the road 39 of the 52 weeks that year. So officially I worked in Ottawa. Functionally, that's just where I got kind of my shirts done and, you know, cleaned up and scrubbed up a bit and then back out, right? And the great gift of that, and the thing I've been always intensely grateful for, is that you really get to know about the country. And not in a kind of, I don't just mean in a campaign stop, airport rally, surfacey way. I mean, you know, on the ground, talking to people, you know, the realities of life. And you come, one, to appreciate the distinctions that that we have in this country, how things really are different. And the other is you come to appreciate the things in common. I mean, to joke for a bit, you know, I remember the first time I was covering a provincial election one time in Nova Scotia, and I was in Sydney, Nova Scotia, up in Cape Breton, where, you know, politics in those days up there was, you know, pretty much a blood sport. And so I was doing interviews, streeters, and I ended up in the Legion Hall, having a sarsaparilla or two with some of the members, and they were all minors, right? And I started to laugh, and I thought, if I had a beam me up Scotty machine, and I dropped these guys into the Legion in Timmins, they'd be there 2 weeks before they figured out they weren't at home. because they, you know, all the realities of the mining world and, you know, conversations about big issues, except they maybe didn't identify them in that, but, you know, environment, worker safety, worker health. These were absolutely points of common, whether you were in Cape Breton or whether you were in Timmins.
And it certainly brings up the question for me. I mean, you're already a very politicized individual who, you know, politics is a natural attraction. I mean, as you're traveling the country, is there a little voice in the back of your head that's saying, hey, Bill, there's a political application for this? You're starting to understand the country in a way that a campaigner fundamentally does. Was there a little voice saying, hey, maybe there's something more than reporting?
No, I don't know that. I mean, I think I ended up leaving for two reasons that were kind of personal. One was a person that I knew as a journalist became the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, a little bit by happenstance. And the reason I knew him was that he was that most valuable commodity in journalism. He was a great source. When I was a correspondent for the Southern group of newspapers in Quebec in the early 1970s, the person that I replaced left me what, you know, in the trade what is called a turnover note. And in the turnover note, he said, by the way, there's a guy in Montreal you got to get to know. He's involved in business, he's involved in politics, he's a labor lawyer, he knows everybody there is to know. And the guy was Brian Mulroney. And the person who left me the note said, you know, you guys will probably get along. You both come from the middle of nowhere. You both, you know, you both got shipped out to school. You know, you got that Irish thing going. So, you know, which is code for the Blarney factor. And, you know, and so, I looked him up, as you would. And sure enough, he was, and Bob Lewis can attest to that. Like, he was an unbelievable source because he was at the meeting point of a number of key constituencies that a correspondent in Quebec would have to cover. So he literally was on the phone most days to the Premier. He was a conservative, so he knew about what was going on in Ottawa. He acted for Power Corp, so he knew what was going on in business. He acted for the labor union, so Louis Laberge was on the phone to him, you know, so in the independence movement, he knew all those people. So like it was like one-stop shopping, you know? It was like going to a big department store. You make one call or one lunch, you got briefed on about 5 things. So, and frankly, I would describe it as a kind of a friendly acquaintance, a professional acquaintance. We got on extremely well, but we weren't hanging out all the time. I mean, we were, you know, we did spend some social time together, usually at lunch. It was a different era then, you know. Today, you know, lunch is pretty kind of straightforward.
Lunch is utilitarian now versus the social dynamic that it originally had.
In those days, you know, a bird bath martini or 2 before lunch, and, you know, maybe a little glass of red or something just to help and then a little Remy just to settle everything down, and then, you know, back to the office no later than 3. Right? And so he had a lot of time to kind of chat about these things. And you know, and I didn't, but I always kind of kept a distance because I knew that he had political aspirations. I covered his campaign for leader in 1976 because I covered all the Quebec candidates for the leadership. Again, kept my distance. Quite frankly, when he didn't win, you know, I kind of thought his political career was maybe over, you know, because Joe Clark had led the party to a minority win, and I thought, you know, he'd be there for the foreseeable future. Mr. Mulroney went back into the world of business, became president of a mining company, and I kind of, so we kept up the friendship. Fast forward to '83, I'm actually in Washington working for the Toronto Star. Toronto Star has one of its management changes, which is, you know, is a semi-regular occurrence at the Star. And And the leader that was appointed in late '83 was a person who didn't ascribe very much value to foreign reporting, foreign news, foreign corresponding, which, you know, when you're a foreign correspondent, it's problematic. Now, of course, as friends of mine at the Star said to me many times later, why were you so impatient? You know, you should have just kind of hunkered down and waited, because there's going to be another change, right? Yeah, wind blows. But I thought, okay, you know, I don't fit this model anymore, and it coincided with Mulroney having won the leadership, not being completely satisfied with the team that he had in the field, and so he phoned me, and literally, this is what he said. He phoned, you know, I mean, you all know the voice, so it's not as if he has to say, hi, it's Brian, right? You know, you kind of, hello, you know who it is. And this is precisely what he said. I picked up the phone, he said, Willie, I'm going to Rome to meet the Pope, do you want to come? Which is kind of a unique way to put a job on. And he was going on a tour to Europe, and the Vatican was one of the stops, and he thought I might be intrigued at meeting, you know, J2P2. So, you know, I ended up a kind of a staffer. And I ended up a staffer in opposition, and came in to a circumstance where he was riding very high in the polls, 62%. I came in as the press secretary and one of the people on the road team. Mr. Trudeau went for his celebrated walk in the snow. He retired. The Liberal Party announced it was going to have a leadership campaign. The campaign unfolded. We absolutely disappeared from the national media. We went under my direction of media strategy and communications from 62% in the polls to somewhere about 30% in the polls, which led to two things. One, you know, Brian kind of looking at me from time to time saying, remind me again why I thought I needed your advice and counsel. And the second was actually a discipline, and that is that we knew that we weren't going to disappear from the national agenda. And so we hit the road, and we developed a tour, a communication vehicle, that we called the Boonies Tour, and we could, because, you know, when you come from places like Bécomo and Timmins, you don't run the risk of being accused of slagging anybody from those towns. And we just hit the road. And, you know, we're all familiar with the notion of playwrights who take a play to New Haven and kind of sharpen it and refine it and then take it into New York City. And that's what we did. We're both old, so we tend to talk about miles, but in 60 days during the Liberal leadership, we logged 57,000 air miles. We logged 7,000 car or bus miles. We were in 60 towns and cities, and several of them several times. And we worked from 6:30 in the morning till about 11 o'clock at night, and we just connected. And we talked to people, and we talked about what their issues were. And I have two memories in particular from that kind of pre-campaign communication rollout. One of them was meeting a very young man in Sherbrooke, Quebec, named Jean Charest, who was going to be the Conservative candidate. And we suggested that he could meet us at the hotel at 7 a.m. And at about 9 p.m. that evening, he looked at me with some concern and exasperation and said, "Are we going to have dinner?" And I said, "Absolutely, not yet. But we're going to get you something before the day's done," right?
Did you get lunch?
On the fly. Although the two rules of a roadie, right? If there's a washroom facility, use it. If there's a sandwich, eat it, because you never know when you're going to see either one of them again. And then the other great memory, and it goes to, you know, community and communication. We were in Castlegar, British Columbia. And, you know, beautiful mountains, and it's a spectacular day, and we're out, you know, I'm doing my run, and everything's great. And we're going to meet some people before the event that evening in the hotel lobby. And so I come back and kind of run through the car wash and go down to the meeting, and they're white hot. And I'm thinking, well, gee, that's kind of not consistent with the day we've had so far, right? And what they were hot about was a decision from the CRTC. And the decision involved a ban that they had imposed on the use of satellite dishes. and it was intended to help cable companies. All of which made perfect sense in Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, Vancouver. Less sense in Castlegar, where there are no cable companies. And even if there were, they don't run the cable out to the ranch that you operate, right? And so what it became, actually, was a conversation less about the satellite dish and more about how government can feel disconnected to people who live in certain parts of the country on issues that actually matter to how they live their lives. And it stuck in my mind because it was illustrative of why you have to be out there, why you have to be talking. Because trust me, you know, satellite dishes were not a big issue in the national media landscape, right? But in that geography, they were actually quite determinate.
Well, and I think we kind of, especially for those of us of a certain age, take for granted how different things were in terms of the way you guys approached politics. That there was literally a Trudeau regime that had been in power for a long time.
Well,
And the Liberals certainly were that sort of natural governing party. And you guys seem to use a number of innovative approaches, certainly for the time. And I think you're describing it partly the way that, I mean, it's interesting. We've had a couple of candidates, both Andrew Cash and Shelley Carroll, talk about the pre-campaign.
Right.
And how important it is before the campaign even starts to be campaigning and to make those personal connections. I'm curious, from your perspective, were you guys, I mean, both you as the contrarian, but also Mulroney and the team, were you guys thinking, we need to do something different? We need, in order for us to win, we can't play the same game over and over. We need to try something new. Was that conscious in terms of you guys thinking about how you would defeat the Liberals?
well, I think it was, yes, I think it was conscious in the context of how you have to communicate. I mean, we used to say at that, I mean, it sounds strange in the current circumstance today, but at the time we used to say, as a matter of course, you know, the Liberal Party has been in power in Canada longer than the Communist Party has been running the former Soviet Union, because the Communists didn't get started till 1917, right? Mm-hmm. And so in actual number of years, that was a true statement. But I think what happened, and it comes to you about technology, a couple of things happened in the very early 1970s. And one of them was that television became the medium of choice for political communication. Up until then, arguably, it was more print, news magazines, newspapers. And the second thing that happened is that television put candidates in direct contact with low involvement voters. Mm-hmm. And again, that was a shift. When I talked earlier about the kind of the 1950s and the service clubs and all of that, I mean, that's how people connected in a community. What TV did was it afforded the leader the chance to connect directly to people who probably never went to a political meeting in their lives, mm-hmm. right? And a couple things happened as a consequence of that. One of them was you had this kind of presumption of a familiarity. So you had these great personas, okay? And at the time, you know, in the United States, you had Ronald Reagan, okay? The great communicator, quote unquote. You know, in fact, he was kind of a standoffish guy. You know, he didn't have like a gazillion friends, and but he had the ability to master the media, right? Mm-hmm. In Canada, we had Mr. Trudeau, who was the sort of the personification of a certain kind of Canadian nationalism. He too wasn't, you know, necessarily I mean, he was friendly in terms of if you met him, but it's not like he was a hail fellow well met, right? But the medium allowed him to connect to people in a way. And so what we understood was that you had to communicate through that medium in a creative way. And what that meant was you became, as a political communicator and as a staff person, and here is where the experience is decidedly different from the candidate, you became a sort of a producer. And you know, I'm not smart enough to explain the theory of semiotics, frankly, but you had to be a bit of a semiotician, right? And you had to think about the whole of the thing. So the staging was important. Where you did it was important. What the visual backdrops were. What the visual cues were. If there was music, if there was a crowd, if there was...
It's all stuff we take for granted now, but then it was all pioneered.
Well, it was relatively new. And so a campaign day, you know, invariably you'd start with what we called a process event, okay? That was usually a mine, a factory, something. And what you were looking for were images of the leader sort of staring intently at whatever was going on there. Making a car, digging a hole, running them at something, okay? Just looking like, man, you know, there's nothing in the world more important than me getting, right? And then you'd go to a process event, or a participation event, and that was, here's where the policy prescription to the problem is going to get articulated. So venues of choice, service clubs. Image you were looking for, people sitting, listening attentively. Okay? Mine, okay. Here's what I'm going to do for miners. Okay? And then you needed an endorsation. That was a good idea. That's when you went to the partisan event. So there you had people cheering wildly. Okay. So process, cheer. Right. That was the sequence. And then, in fact, when we first started, it was still in the film era. You had to put it in canisters. Now think about this. Think about this. You had to put it in canisters. You had to put the canister in an orange mesh sack, which you then handed to the Air Canada pilot, who delivered it to Toronto, to the networks. Okay? So you think the Pony Express is inefficient? Try that sometime from Inuvik. Okay? ENG obviously started to change all that. But that was how kind of days were organized. And then you saw it on a screen. Now the irony is, as a political staffer for Brian Mulroney, there was a challenge inherent in that for me. And here was the challenge. If you think about an actor, screen actor versus stage actor. Okay? Screen actor's kind of a minimalist, right? It's a George Clooney kind of arch an eyebrow, that's enough, right? Stage actor's more expansive. Brian Mulroney was emphatically a stage actor. Brian Mulroney grew up in an era where people went to public meetings. Brian Mulroney thought it was incumbent on him to make that an uplifting experience for every single soul in the room. So he was expansive, he was expressive, he was larger than life. And everybody in the room typically loved it. Okay? 300, 400 people, 500, it didn't matter how many. They'd be cheering, they'd be, you know, all great if you were in the room. That night on the 11 o'clock news, sometimes you look like a crazy person. Because he'd be gesturing, you know, and he'd be tearing stuff up.
And would that lead to people at least
yeah.
underestimating him before he was in power?
Or it would lead to sharp criticism of, you know, he's over the top. And of course, and how it gets expressed internally, politically, is that they'd come at both of us. They'd say, he's a problem, and you're actually adding fuel to the fire because you got the same problem, because you're another Irish BSer, right? So the brains trust at one point got to a view that we had to change that, and we had to change the persona, and it was all driven by the technology. Now, my personal view is we created a bigger problem than we set out to solve, because my own view was, I'm not saying that the Blarney factor wasn't a factor, but what I'm saying is it was baked in. It was part of the equation. The challenge was when you start to alter what is the core person, what you're actually communicating is an artifice. And the communication of the artifice is a bigger problem than the problem. Right? Because then you get to authenticity. And you know, when people talk about TV cameras and they say, you know, the camera doesn't lie, that's part of what they're talking about. You can see that.
I'm curious, though, too, in terms of a thread. I mean, any innovation, any new stuff is generally rejected by people who like the way things are. Did you find that either in the party or in the larger political discourse that people didn't necessarily value or didn't necessarily take you guys as seriously as you should have been taken, given that you then went on to form the government?
I think less rejected, more ascribing more motive than was there. And I'll give you a classic illustration. So, and it all gets compounded, right? So because my last job before I went to work in politics was working in the White House, of course, people just assumed that all I did was, when I was a White House correspondent, I didn't cover anything, I just took notes, right? And I just brought all these kind of White House techniques up to Ottawa. And the symbolic illustration of that was, you know, we had a podium, okay? And this immediately became a subject of media scrutiny and commentary. And the take on it was the introduction of a presidential style, okay? And it was, you know, the handler over here is responsible, and that's what it is. Well, here's the dirty little secret about the podium. First of all, it was actually Mr. Trudeau's podium, okay? Okay? I found it in the basement of the Langevin block, okay? And Mr. Trudeau had it for the exact same reason we did. So you could have a unimic, okay? It was technology, okay? Instead of having, remember in the old days you'd have the photo of the microphone, and there'd be like 19 microphones, and they'd all be wrapped in masking tape. And so, you know, guess what? There's technology to deal with that. Okay? You can have a nice little neat thing, right? So, but you couldn't convince anybody of that, right? It was all, you know, well, you know, this is what they're doing, and this is what they're, but here's where I think it tended to get lost a little bit. People make an assumption that you go to that level of detail in substance, or as a substitute for a substantive message. Okay? So the take on it is, it's all about flash. It's all about staging. It's all about. My own view is it's actually exactly the reverse. You pay attention to that much detail so as not to distract from the substantive point that you're trying to make. Because everybody remembers the famous campaign photos where that didn't happen, you know. I mean, I remember one time we were doing an advance in 1988, and the team was out, and it was the free trade election, quote unquote, right? And so, you know, one of the events was going to be in a high school, and the high school, like all high schools, have athletic teams, and the athletic team is named somethings, right? So this particular high school, the team was the Screaming Eagles, okay? So stage, podium, right over Brian's head is the world's biggest eagle who's looking at
In a free trade election.
I don't care what kind of a case you were trying to make about free trade, it was not going to get made. You know, it just wasn't going to happen. I'm sorry.
Well, and it certainly matches when Shelley Carroll was here. She spent a lot of time talking about how important messaging is,
Yeah.
and how because the left has either demonized it or rejected it, they're shooting themselves in the foot because they're limiting their own ability to get their message out. And so I'm curious. I mean, going from being in journalism to then being not so much in a hostile, but an adversarial relationship with the media, just by nature of politics. I mean, to what extent, I mean, and I also want to tie this into being on the road, that, you know, when you're running a campaign, especially back then when there was no internet, when you did have to go to all these communities to get into their media, to get that type of coverage, how do you manage that need for messaging with the chaos of a campaign and the hectic nature that kind of travel naturally ensues?
And that's the tension of a tour, of a leader's tour. And I've seen it from both sides. You know, in 1980, when Mr. Clark's government kind of walked itself off a cliff in December of '79, right? Assuring all of us that were in the gallery that they were not going to be defeated. There was not going to be an election. Give your head a shake. The Liberals don't even have a leader, quote unquote, because Mr. Trudeau had retired. So, government's defeated. We have an election. It takes the Liberals about a half an hour to get a leader. Not that big a whoop. Okay. So an hour after that, we're all on the planes heading out, right? Except no fool, Senator Keith Davey, who was the campaign strategist at the time. He's going into this campaign with a 22-point lead. So here's his media strategy. They had Bob, me, a bunch of people. They put us on a campaign plane. We start the day in Calgary. Okay? Where's the next stop? Fredericton. What are we going to do there? Going to have an event. Okay. And after Fredericton, where are we going next? Edmonton. I swear to God, if Keith Davey had figured out how to refuel that campaign plane in midair, we never would have landed. No, that's right. Right. And so we protest, right? We express our displeasure. We even take to wearing protest T-shirts. We have red T-shirts made up, and we go to every event and we sit in the front with our protest. Right? Trudeau's He's chuckling, right? A little comic relief, always good for him in the course of a day. It changed nothing, okay? He wins by not 20 points, but enough points. And he's got a majority, and the rest is, like say, is history. So fast forward 4 years later, now I'm on the other side, okay? Now I've got a campaign chair who says, it is imperative that we keep discipline around messaging in this campaign. So here's your whip, here's the chair, your job, keep all those media lines on that stool. Limited access, limited, well, guess what? Now I'm on the receiving end of the bellowing, and you know, you produce him right now, and now I'm trying to manage the mutiny, right? Literally reporters at one stop in southwestern Ontario saying to me, we are not getting on that bus unless you produce him right now. Right? And me, friendly fellow that I am, standing there with the cameras rolling, and this is the direct quote. That bus is leaving in 5 minutes. It is a matter of some indifference to me whether or not you are on it. Okay. So the world's biggest lightning bolt's getting ready to strike me dead, right? Because on a bunch of levels, not the least of which is, that's actually not true. It is in my interest that they get on that bus. Yeah. But you have to manage that tension. And you know, in fairness, I got on the bus, and I was always on the leader's bus, and I got on the phone of the campaign, and I said, listen, you know, stop. Like, next stop, we are going to do a media availability. But it's hard because, you know, you're running a campaign to a strategy. You're running a campaign to a thematic message or messages. You are trying to stay on message, and the media are trying to bring their agenda, right? So what it comes down to, Jesse, is it's the joust for control of the gatekeeper function. That's what it is.
And I mean, to what extent, and I'm asking this both from your perspective, but also from the candidate's perspective, how crucial was it that you and Brian had that relationship, that A, went back far enough on a respect level, but I'm also inferring that there was a lot of trust between the two of you, both for reasons that you had a similar background. I mean, could a candidate have a press secretary that they didn't trust? Would that be viable in any way? Or is it as a prerequisite, a requirement, that you have that type of relationship because the press secretary could break you in the sense that if they make a gaffe, it's the candidate who's going to have to wear it? I mean, to what extent did that allow you to do things perhaps that you wouldn't have been able to do without that tighter relationship?
I think the answer to that is a bit of a depends, you know? I mean, the hardest thing for political people to get through their collective heads is that media are neither friend nor foe. They are a professional intermediary to constituencies that you are trying to reach. And way too often, a political person, especially if they have a long history with media as source, have a tendency to think that personal relationships would matter. And it was a source of huge tension between the former Prime Minister and I, because his premise was, well, these are all your buddies, you know? And I always knew how the conversation would go, because the phone would ring, and I would pick it up. And before anything was said, I'd hear, you know your friend Simpson, okay? And of course, you know, that would be Jeff Simpson, the columnist for the Globe and Mail, and he would have written something that, you know, had caused concern. And the presumption was that somehow the fact that Jeff Simpson and I had been friends for 25 years, that was going to be factored into the mix. Well, it's not. And you know, and I would say that because Brian had such extensive media relationships in his own right, he was on a first name basis with every journalist in Quebec of consequence, and most national journalists. He was a great buddy of Peter Newman's. He was a great buddy, you know, and so he just assumed that's how it was going to work. George Bush 41, tended to make the same assumptions. Jean Chrétien, on the other hand, and Bill Clinton, they were more in the land of it's professional, you know. I mean, when I was a young reporter, we all liked Mr. Chrétien, okay, for a very basic thing. His phone number was in the phone book, okay, in Ottawa. Now, when you're the junior person in an Ottawa bureau, it means, one, you're the weekend stiff, right? And something happens on the weekend, and some smarm on the desk in Toronto picks up the phone and says, get a comment from a cabinet minister. Like that's easy to do, right? Well, you got out the old annuaire in Ottawa, and you looked on Chrétien, Jean, Playfair Park. Here was his number. Phone him. He'd take the call, right? So there was a good professional relationship, but he was never a guy that kind of went out of his way to think about journalists as friends, right? That was a complicated. Now, where it did work was, in the old kind of universe of speak truth to power, I mean, if there's a personal relationship there and some difficult conversations have to happen, they can happen, and they're accepted. And I'm also a believer, like I'm hopelessly tribal about this stuff, so I'll just concede that off the top. But like I think a political staffer's job is to take the hit. I just believe that's what you're there to do. I don't believe you're there to talk about what went on. I don't believe you're there to write insider books. I believe you're there to take the hit.
Like a Secret Service guard.
Absolutely. And if there's a problem, you created the problem. And if there, yeah, well, that's your job. And if you don't know that going in, then, find another job.
I mean, I like to kind of go chronologically, but that almost begs me to jump to the presidency. I mean, to what extent have you seen the political culture in Canada change away from the kind of more loyalist, tribal to a more Machiavellian, in which I mean, it's interesting you say that the staffer's job is to take the bullet, is to take the fall. Do you? I mean, I don't think that mentality still exists. I don't think that there is the same type of commitment to a greater good. I mean, have you, without getting into too much of a sweeping generalization, to what extent have you seen Canadian politics and campaigns change since the Mulroney years, over the last couple of decades?
Well, they've changed dramatically, and they're on the cusp of another they are in the cusp of a change as big and as fundamental and as tectonic today as occurred in the late 60s and early 70s with the emergence of television. I mean, all the stuff that like I'm a museum piece, okay? All the stuff that I knew, lived, like that's gone. That's just not going to happen anymore. And no, I'm more a Clay Shirky, ecosystem kind of person. But the way you campaign, like the Leaders Tour, they're still trying to do that to some extent. Well, and I'm not involved with it very much anymore, but I kind of watch that and say, what are you doing that for? Like, that was a really terrific, innovative idea in 1961. Hello, go like that, something stuck.
I mean, care to brainstorm an alternative? Like, if you were the press secretary for a leader of a national party, and everyone was out to go on these leader tours, can you think of a curveball that might steal attention, but also do things differently?
Well, yeah, I think. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it because the academic work I'm doing tends to be in financial markets and financial reporting, which ironically is behind the curve on some of this stuff because of reasons around selective disclosure law and securities exchange law, et cetera. But I think Twitter, for instance. I would love to have had Twitter. I think as an instant response mechanism, I don't know that the world has ever invented anything better, right? In terms of a short, sharp boom, I need this out instantly, before this story, gets legs and gets going, as I say, I think that's really good. I think the whole interactive, because, if you think about legacy media and this whole gatekeeper function, right? Journalism is reinventing itself. And therefore, by definition and extension, if journalism's reinventing itself, then political communication has to reinvent itself. I'm an old school person. I grew up thinking that, journalism was a primary site of political discourse, to quote Tom Leonard, that, journalism provides the vernacular for speech. Still true, right? If I say two words, Arab Spring, we all know what I'm talking about, right? But the notion of that kind of megaphone, top-down, passive audience model that I lived in my time, gone. Totally gone. So you have to be, and the notion of journalist as authority. a couple of years ago, at the Canadian Journalism Foundation, when Morley Safer was getting a deserved award, somebody asked him about citizen journalism, and his answer was, and I think this is the exact quote, I feel the same way about a citizen journalist as I would about a citizen surgeon. Well, in the model that he championed, that's true, right? But it's a different model now. It's about authenticity more than authority. It's about a kind of an exchange that gets to a place, as opposed to here's what happened, right? And like in my time, we wrote everything, every lead or every quote ended with these two or three words, right? So-and-so said yesterday, okay? Well, the said yesterday world, gone. It's gone, right? So, I lived in the Herb Gans world where news was made by knowns, by people in authority. The gathering of news was organized around set piece places: the police beat, City Hall, Queen's Park, Parliament Hill. Right? That'll be less the case going forward. So if you're a political communicator, and the irony is, in the early days of cable, as much as the audience exploded and fragmented and all of that, but the power of the knowns actually grew, because cable, CNN became almost wholly dependent on official sources. Right? So the State Department person who used to get like a phrase in the New York Times now got 10 minutes. Right? But that's going to change, and now it's going to be a kind of a cumulative process, and so political communication is going to have to change accordingly. And one of the illustrations, I was at this session at the Shorenstein Center on Press Politics and Public Policy at Harvard last fall, and they were talking about Arab Spring. And what was of interest to me was the argument that was made that it could not and did not happen without, one, the social activist community, the people who've been on the ground doing the work for 20, 30 years. Two, social media that allowed the connector for all of that to happen. But three, the legacy media as well, who had to bring it to the attention of the wider community, right? And like I was watching Game Change last night on HBO, the movie with, it's based on Sarah Palin. It's a terrific little piece of work, but anyway. But the vignette that captured me was, at one point, the Palin character is sitting watching, in horror, watching Tina Fey's send-up on Saturday Night Live, right? But the reality is, most of us actually didn't see it on Saturday Night Live, right? Most of us saw the YouTube clip, right? Because most of us aren't sitting at home at 11:30 on Saturday night, right? So we don't watch it live.
Well, and I'd certainly encourage anyone who's interested, the microphone over there is a good place to start and line up for questions. My last question before we turn over to the group is around TV debates, because I think that's a natural. If we're criticizing the notion of a leader's tour, I mean, it seems TV debates are also kind of stuck in the 1960s or the 1970s. And you were actually involved in negotiating the TV debate of the last federal election. So I'm curious both to hear your thoughts on how the parties are looking at those debates and what you think should be done. I mean, how could we rejuvenate those debates so that they do reflect a little more of the new media and its properties rather than television in terms of it being an aging medium?
Yeah. Well, two things. One, I'll just give you a little context. I was actually asked by the Conservative Party, along with Tom Long, to go in and negotiate the terms around the leaders' debate for the last federal campaign. And I tend not to be involved very much anymore because I believe passionately that there's no point in changing the leader if all the hangers-on are the same. So, guys like me that have had their chance, like, basically get the hell out of the road and make way for the next generation, right? But every once in a while, you get these discrete assignments. And you go into that negotiation, and it kind of goes on two levels. One of them is just the kind of the notion around a television production and its potential to exchange information. And then the second is strategic. So let me deal with the first one. The ask of me was, we need to get those rules changed. Because the way it was structured the last time, everybody was talking over everybody all the time. and nobody could hear anything, and it was incoherent and at all. Everybody sounded like, the construction crew in the Tower of Babel. But they said, but that's not going to be an easy assignment because all the networks have signed off, and the other parties are all assigned on to the old structure. So kind of good luck, right? But, so then you take advantage of your circumstance. And part of our circumstance was Mr. Ignatieff had already trumpeted the fact that he wanted a one-on-one debate with Mr. Harper, right? Now, in his head, it was a bit to marginalize everybody else. In my head, it was something else. So I go in and I say, here's the good news. Mr. Ignatieff wants a one-on-one, so do I. But here's what I want. I want rotating one-on-ones. And the fact that Elizabeth May had been eliminated, and I'll park for a second the merit of that decision, the numbers worked. You could have 6 segments, you could have a series of one-on-one, it all worked, right, logistically. So now I'm saying, why don't we give him what he wants? Okay, so the Liberal negotiator, he's got to deal with that, right? But the notion in my head was, if you have an exchange with people, then the person watching it has a better opportunity to come to a view about where that person is. The pushback from the networks was, yeah, but what if we get a segment where people are in kind of violent agreement, okay? Which in an interesting way presaged at one level the kind of NDP leadership that we've been living through, right? And so that what the network came back to us was and said, what if we split it? What if we started each segment with a one-on-one, and then we had a more round table after that? And then it was just a matter of negotiating how much time, right? But of course, I wasn't going to get that on my own. I needed an ally. And my ally was Brian Topp, right? Very savvy guy in these things. And the reason I had a hunch that Brian was going to be my ally was that I knew, or I thought I knew, that for sure he was not going to allow Mr. Layton to be marginalized by Ignatieff's, just us big boys will have this out and then the rest of you can fill in the blank later. I knew that was not going to happen. And the second thing was, I was pretty sure that Mr. Layton was going to do a real job on Mr. Ignatieff. I was actually pretty confident about how that was going to go. So anyway, let's just say Brian and I came to a point where we could find common cause. Yeah. And that's...
and arguably, I think, had a significant impact on the final outcome in that Layton did perform exceptionally well. And a lot of the Liberal support went orange, I suspect, because of that performance.
Well, yes, but in fairness, only because they did a lot of really hard work before that. Mm-hmm. Okay, those everybody talks about TV leaders debate and the famous exchange. Okay, and in my case, there's 2 examples. '84 was the famous exchange between Mr. Turner and Mr. Mulroney on the subject of appointments to the Senate. Okay. As Mr. Trudeau took his leave, he had left a list behind of people that he thought were worthy of appointment. And Mr. Turner, as the incoming, appointed them. What was interesting about that exchange is that we, the public, when we watched that, our takeaway was it was an exchange about patronage. But when I talked to Mr. Mulroney about it years later, he thought it was actually more, the point he was making was more about leadership, right? Like in his head, it wasn't about 6 senators. It was, what do you mean you had to do it? Like you're the boss, you know? You have to do anything, right? And it was really revealing to me because, Walter Lippmann, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, wrote as a caution that we should never assume that the word that we use, whether we're a reporter or a political communicator, that is intended to trigger the picture in the head is received exactly the same way by the audience as we intended. Right? It's a 2-step process, and there can be gaps. And that exchange was, to me, was a classic illustration of the gap. Because in Brian's head, it was about leadership. And what we all heard was, frankly, our takeaway from it was, he's not going to appoint anybody. Well.
But
okay. Moving right along.
It also brings back It also brings back, though, your point about Twitter, that it's that type of feedback mechanism that can close those loops so that you don't think what you're thinking is having this effect. You see the effect and can adjust your messaging accordingly.
And now that you have all these kind of structured events, right, and you have all like the spinner's room, because it's all about expectations now, right? It's all about, I was third, but I really won. Okay. Just want to help me with that? Or yeah, but I'm running against, Massachusetts governor in New Hampshire, and I'm from Georgia, so of course I'm third, right? But Twitter can help that, because, one of the phenomenon that people are talking about in Ottawa in terms of political coverage is the tweets between journalists through the day. Mm-hmm. And a lot of chatter about our stories getting baked that way. Mm-hmm. Is that the new expression of PAC journalism? Right? So I have a view, so I'm working for the Star, so I check it with not a competitor in terms of print, but maybe somebody else, and they say, I didn't see it quite that way. And between our exchanges, by about 4 o'clock, we're pretty well settled on what the storyline is, right? Well, if you're a political communicator, you can be in that process. The challenge that I see is, and again, I'll quote Clay Shirky, it's not the technology that's important, it's the behaviors that are changed that are consequential. Mm-hmm. And political people have always been quick to take and embrace a new technology. So historians write about the fact, for instance, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who pioneered the weekly radio report, which was his technology of his time, but I mean, he employed poets and playwrights and the very best writers and minds and creative people in America to work on what was a 5-minute radio broadcast. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, to this day, the U.S. president does a radio broadcast every Saturday. It's still part of the mix, right? Mm-hmm. But what's more substantive is when the behaviors start to change. And again, if you think about TV, like I'm old enough, I actually remember the early days of TV, okay? And the early days of TV were basically radio. Okay? They put Ed Sullivan on TV. Who could look at Ed Sullivan and say, oh, TV? Mm-hmm. Like he's a natural. Huh? He's kind of doer-looking guy, who was an old print guy from way back when. Mm-hmm. And it took the next generation, it took people like you to say, whoa. I don't have to take the stage production of a play and put it on TV. I can do all kinds of other things. Mm-hmm. And that's where political communication is going to go. Mm-hmm. But it's not going to be people like me that figure it out. It's actually going to be people like you.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've got time for questions, and Ed is up and ready.
Well, my question is directly related to what you're already talking about, which is interesting, because now you just said it's not going to be people like you who figure it out, so maybe you don't have as many thoughts on this. But when you were talking about the tour you took Mulroney on to combat the Liberal leadership, there's two elements to that. Of course, you got the backdrops, like you can have him standing looking at the mine, but also, like when you were talking about being on the road yourself, you're out in neighborhoods, meeting people, hearing from them, finding out what their core issues are. They're really hot about satellite dishes. We wouldn't know that if we didn't go there and meet those people, right? And I'm wondering, Twitter can be a really good way, potentially, and it's obviously, I guess, and Facebook or whatever, to speak directly to constituents in certain ways. But it seems to me that it also could be a way, if people can figure it out, to get that feedback, that without going on tour, you can have a more intimate back and forth with people. Although I have no idea how that, and I guess this is my question, is how, from your perspective, would you see that kind of system getting built into a campaign in the way that meet and greets used to be?
Mm-hmm. I agree with everything you said, and I would add that it could also inform your tour. Mm-hmm. It could also help you understand better where you need to be, mm-hmm. and who you need to be engaged with, and what you need to be talking about. It's kind of a feedback loop that doesn't need to be just from the distance. You could actually use it to say, I need to get out there, because it's interesting, even on big issues, like I mentioned the free trade election, right? And one of the conceits sometimes in the policy community is, well, it's too complicated, right? They won't get it, okay? Well, you know what? You go to Sault Ste. Marie, you go on you go into Algoma, those guys on the shop floor and those women on that shop floor, they actually have a pretty clear understanding of what free trade is going to mean to the steel industry, right? And they might actually know even maybe a little more about it than some policy wonk in Ottawa. Who knows? But you'd certainly be the better for the exchange, right? And so that's one of the things I think Twitter could do, and tweets can do, is it could help you understand better where you got to get to. And unfortunately, my worry about journalism is that they will get too far removed from those kinds of direct contacts and direct exchanges. And I understand the economics of it. You know, I mean, I was reading a thing the other day where advertising revenue in print has gone from, 60 billion 10 years ago to 20 or something. Well, guess what? You got a business model that's built on 60 billion of activity, and all of a sudden you're staring at 20. Yeah, things are going to change, right?
Dan, did you have a question?
You talked a little bit about this when you about the campaign, but one of the things that really came about during your time was polling.
Yeah.
And one of the things I was curious about is the narrative you see a lot from governments of all stripes is that it doesn't really matter unless the people care about it. So no matter what scandal comes about, the line usually given is well, people don't really care about this. So you saw that researching some of the stuff that from the early 80s about campaign, how much it's, these promises were going to cost, and the line kind of coming out of your camp was, well, the public's not too concerned. And the polling came in. So like DMI from the States kind of came up and helped Alan Gregg with Decima. I was just curious about that whole process and how dependent we are on polls from a political standpoint.
And to give a bit of background, Dan was actually able to dig up a Linda Debo profile from the early 80s that looked at you and Alan and sort of the start of the campaign, which was interesting background that he circulated on Twitter for us all to check out.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm a great believer in research. Absolute, unapologetic, huge believer in public opinion research. But I do not believe that the research is the substitute for the content and the idea. I think the research helps you come to a better understanding of expectation, helps inform the language that you use, helps inform the way you communicate. But make no mistake about it, research can't tell you what the answer is because people can't know what they don't know, right? And one of the problems in political communication typically is they're reluctant to spend enough time talking about the problem because they're hardwired to only want to come forward when they've got a notion of what they think is the solution, okay? So it's what I call the Moses School of Communication, right? They come down from the mountain, they got the 2 rocks, they got the 10 rules, they read them off, and we're all supposed to just say, great, okay? Well, as the Bible informs us, it actually didn't work for Moses either. Yeah. Spent 40 years wandering that desert. Because, if you don't know there's a problem, why would you be engaged in a conversation around a potential solution? And it's that kind of leader as hero that's the problem. That expectation that the leader has all the answer all the time to whatever the specific is. And again, that leader focus, Jesse, is driven by technology, TV. Okay? Again, I was accused of, introduction of the presidential style. And it's a problem in a parliamentary democracy that has a system of responsible government. The whole notion of ministerial responsibility. And the fact is, it's leader-centric. Well, because TV is leader-centric. And the structure of TV, you go to the theories of Shanto Iyengar and people like that, it's what's the problem? Who is the person that has the power to either alleviate the problem or forestall alleviation of the problem, right? So the agenda setting property, here's what we think is important. Step 1. Priming, think about the leader in the context of what we think is important. Third step, bandwagon effect. We start to express ourselves through public opinion research, and there's always a little tip up because once we get a notion that there's a herd forming up, we're often pretty comfortable being in that herd, right? So there's always a little kind of tip up at the end. And that's why you get all these debates about should polls be published during campaigns and all that stuff, right? But those were absolute patterns. So, you know, you say free trade's important. You campaign based on, here's what I can do about that. And then people express themselves around free trade. And you get an outcome. Right? Well, in your universe, that's going to be, how you're going to get to the agenda and the shared agenda is a big issue.
Well, and it's funny you use the phrase agenda-setting media, because, I mean, where that was a singular term, now, if anything, it's Twitter. But Twitter is not a media, it's a platform.
Yeah.
So how that agenda gets set is both dynamic and somewhat random. So it kind of wants me, one of the threads I've been hearing in this conversation that is somewhat tangential to your experience, but relevant to what we do at campaign school, and that's the role of pundits and punditry. And what part of it is social media obviously lowers the bar, that anyone can now be a pundit. Anyone now has the power to add their 2 cents in analysis. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on both how that's evolved. I mean, you mentioned how CNN initially just reinforced existing authorities, and now that is starting to change. I mean, on the one hand, are you critical of the type of punditry culture that's emerged? But on the other hand, do you see punditry as an avenue for a young person who arguably is not going to get a job at a newspaper, because there are no jobs at the newspaper, as a way for them to be involved, to start getting out there so they can start at least participating in the process, if not learning more about where to have an impact and where to have influence?
Okay, so now I'm going to sound like one of those old guys whining about the 6-team NHL, okay? But I used to be a dancing bear on TV, okay? I was one of the political pundits on CTV back in the day. And I took over from Huey Siegel. The initial panel was Jerry Kaplan from the New Democratic Party, Senator Michael Kirby from the Liberal Party, and Huey. And then Huey went into the PMO, so I took his spot. A bit like replacing somebody on a successful, you know, Broadway show. You kind of bask in the success, but you had nothing to do with creating it. But there was an absolute and marked difference, and it's this. We were engaged as people with an experience set. And we were expected to speak to issues from our perspective, with our insights. We were expected to spar, obviously. It is TV, after all. But there was no expectation that I was sort of rentatory. Okay? Subsequently, I did a similar panel on CBC with Michael Decter. I was recruited because I was seen as a person with a federal perspective of a kind of a center-right persuasion. Michael was recruited because he was seen as somebody with an extensive political background of a center-left. But emphatically, we were not there to carry water for anybody else. Right? What's evolved is this kind of talking point punditry, where, you know, they're like robots, and they got 3 talking points. And unfortunately for them, you know, the interview often extends past the 3 points. And then they're gasping for air. So they just keep repeating them. And there is no exchange. There is no, right?
And it's bad television.
And it's bad TV. But it doesn't have to be. I don't know if any of you watch MSNBC, but there's a program in the morning, Morning Joe, right? Joe Scarborough, right-wing Republican kind of guy. Mika Brzezinski's, you know, kind of the left. But a really interesting mix, an eclectic mix of participants, you know, writers, rock stars, newspaper columnists, political activists, campaign people. It's smart conversation. You don't have to agree with any of it, but it's smart. And there's no reason that we can't have that. And there's no reason we shouldn't have it. And part of what part of the reason I'm really excited about kind of blogs and tweet and things like that is that it's the capacity to challenge, you know, some of that kind of talking head TV. Now, look, when you're on the receiving end of it, it's not pleasant, you know, like you write a book and you just get absolutely slaughtered by somebody, and you just think, you know, man, you know. Like, why did I fire up that computer? You know, but you know, here's where I think it's going. When you talk to the people at Politico in Washington, one of the reasons they started that organization is that they noticed that there was a discrepancy. Unlike a lot of people from startups, these were largely people who were part of the media, political media establishment in Washington, right? Washington Post reporters. But they noticed that when they were having their meetings every day around what was going to go on the front page, and decisions would be made based on the usual journalistic tests of novelty, exception, you know, all that stuff, that when they went to their online version, the hits on the online version didn't align with the front page. And the best illustration of that was when Washington went through one of its sporadic debt ceiling crisis moments. The front page wasn't running much of it because there wasn't, you know, like day to day, there wasn't that much that was kind of new, quote unquote. So they tended to run the stuff inside. But far and away, it was the reader's choice on the online version. And what it said to me is this notion of people don't want to get involved in really kind of hard, messy things. Actually, they do. They need a place to do it, and you know, and you need a forum to facilitate it. But far from diminishing the value of content, I think it's a premium around content. Because we're no longer hostage to local media, right? That's the other thing. We can actually seek out the very best.
Well, and it addresses the you don't know what you don't know because it allows the users to tell you what they want to know in a more bottom-up fashion rather than expecting the editor or the publisher to have that sense like weather of what is the most newsworthy story. So it certainly expands the way in which politics can participate in general. David, did you have a question? Is that why you're standing near the mic, or are you just moving around? So I'm curious if if you think, I mean, it's interesting how a lot of this is potential, and that it does kind of fundamentally either A, wait for a generation to, whether via one of the parties to come in and change things, but at the same time, we've also been describing a kind of complacency amongst the media in terms of they're not necessarily going to come up with a new way of doing things. And your point about Twitter, that if anything, it's just making the groupthink a little more transparent. But nonetheless, there is still that there. What do you think Canadian politics needs to be kicked out of that complacency, to get a sense of either A, making it more interesting, because voter participation has been going down, or to make it more relevant so that people feel connected and feel that politics is something that they should take seriously?
Well, what's the great quote from Robespierre, you know? There go my people and I must follow, for I'm their leader, right? So but political people are pretty clever about figuring out, you know, how to get in front of it, you know, and turning it into a parade, right? And I think they're going to do that. First of all, I think the media will figure it out, okay? I think the media went through a period, not the creative side of the media, but the ownership side of the media, went through a period of, you know, they kind of built on a business model that took on a lot of debt. Then the servicing of that debt got to be problematic. They looked for economies in the one place that they probably couldn't and shouldn't have, and that is in the content creation. And what they did was, I think they started a spiral downward. And they ended up with a product that failed our value test, right? So if there's no reason to read it, to pay for it, then you're not going to. And I'll use sports for illustrative purposes because sports people figured this out a long time ago. Okay, there's no like the passing recently of the legendary Bill Frame. You know, like there was a golden era of sports writers that we all celebrate. You know, the Trent Frains and the Jimmy Colemans and the Scott Youngs and whatever. What was their genius? We knew the score, right? We knew it was, you know, Habs 4, Leafs nothing. Just
Just to be predictable.
But they took us somewhere else, and they gave us an experience that was so far above the mere repetition of the score. Great magazine journalism's the same, right? And when the news hole started to shrink and the reporting resource started to shrink and the product therefore started to reflect those facts, we started to move away from it. and you get into the whole debate around paywalls and all the rest of that, but I think we will go back to the content creator. I think we want it. I think we're prepared to engage on it. I think we're prepared to pay for it, and I think the media will figure it out.
Well,
And therefore, I think the political people will as well.
And as a way to put in a plug, in fact, our YouTube school, which happens on alternating Sundays, is very much looking at that and then looking at the way that content creators in an automated marketplace like YouTube, if they build an audience, they are then able to create revenue in really interesting and innovative ways that, in fact, evoke that original sports writer, in that they're dealing with content that's universally accessible, but it's the commentary, it's the analysis that I think adds a lot of value. Did we have a question there at the back?
Yeah. You spoke about the importance of a leader being able to communicate and connect with people, like on a personal level, and what an important skill it is. And you know, I think Mulroney had that, Trudeau had that. Let's say Jack had that ability. We've got Reagan and Clinton, and yet we keep seeing candidates coming up who do not appear to have this ability. Is it such a rare quality in a person, or are these candidates being told that they have it and they don't really have it? Or I mean, the Liberal Party of Canada has the last two candidates where, you know, anyone could see these people were not able to connect with normal people. Is the problem that it's too rare a quality, or are these people are they saying they can win without that ability? What are we missing?
My own view is it's Gladwell's 10,000 hours. Okay, it is like the rock and roll business. You know, you spend 25 years to be an overnight success. Right? I mean, Randy Bachman was doing a thing in Toronto this week, and he was talking about when he started, you know, with what we now or became the Guess Who. They had to play 5 sets a night, 50 minutes a set. Think about that. Every night. Think about how much you have to, how hard you're working at your craft. And you do that for years and years and years. I think the problem with TV and the leadership focus of a certain era was there was a presumption that you could do that, there were shortcuts to that, and that you could do that. There isn't. It's like everything else. It's the 10,000 hours. And you learn it in the community. And you learn it in the, you know, like you don't get there any other way. I mean, I don't want to pick on current, you know, candidates for high office, but how smart do you have to be if you're worth, you know, a couple $100 million to declare yourself for public office and not think that you better have an answer on that point? And that your answer better not be somewhere between 150 and 220 million, right? That's just absurd. Okay? I mean, it may be factually true. He may genuinely not know, but you know what? It's crazy, right? And it's because you didn't spend enough time. You didn't work in the trenches. You didn't learn your craft. You didn't learn your trade. And it's a craft. And the parameters, you know, will shift as the media shifts, as the media ecosystem shifts. So there was a period when being a star TV performer was expected. And yes, you can say it wasn't fair to certain people, you know? I mean, when Bob and I were in the parliamentary press gallery, sucker bet in the bar, okay, when you're in there late at night, which some of us were more than others, you know, you'd walk up to somebody and say, who's taller, Joe Clark or Pierre Trudeau? Right? They couldn't get the money out of their pocket fast enough to bet on Trudeau. He was like 5 or 6 inches shorter than Clark, right? Like it was a great sucker bet. Right?
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that you tie in. I mean, if we were to tie in this notion of you know the stage actor versus the film actor, and extend that further to the social media world,
it'll be something else.
As a political communicator, if someone came to you and let's pretend that we don't know their age. So they could be young, they could be old, but it's 2012, and they came to you and they said, Bill, I'm really eager to run for office, but you know, I don't understand this social media stuff. Would you tell them right away, well, forget about it? Like, unless you're willing to put in the time to figure out how the interactive technology is legitimately changing the political land, because it strikes me that there still are lots of people running for public office who either dismiss or ignore the new media and the new technology. I mean, do you think that or do you think they can get away with it, perhaps, is a better?
No, they can't. No, they think they can. And the equivalent in our time was political leaders would declare with some great pride, quote, "I never watch TV." Okay? I'd be sitting there thinking, okay, I used to think you were stupid. Now I know. Okay. Like, on what basis would you not be aware of a medium that has emerged as the medium of choice, right? And there were all kinds of conceits, by the way, about TV. You know, there was an assumption that you couldn't communicate anything substantive on television, right? At one point, I was hired as a consultant to the UK government because they were introducing TV into the House. And the reason that they wanted a Canadian rather than an American is that they needed somebody who understood question period. And so my contact was Sir Geoffrey Howe, who was the Deputy Prime Minister. And at one point he phoned, and we were on this conference call, and he was explaining that, you know, Mrs. Thatcher was of a view that you couldn't say anything substantive, you know, in a clip, right? And because I had the benefit of being on a conference call and this security of distance, I was able to be smarmy with my answer. And I said, well, tell Mrs. Thatcher that much of the Western liberal democracies and Judeo-Christian tradition evolves around 10 rules that textually don't total 100 words. So, number 5, thou shalt not kill. It's not that long. Many pages in the criminal code that deal with it, right? But it fits a clip, okay? It's an 8-second clip. Now, Sir Geoffrey wasn't sure he wanted to repeat that verbatim, but he took the point, and he, you know, he went back. But actually, I was actually trying to be serious on one level, because, you know, you have to master, like, why is it unreasonable to expect somebody who aspires to leadership to have a certain skill set? And if at a point in time, you know, that involves being able to communicate on television, then why is it so wrong to expect people to be able to do that? And why would we be upset if people, you know, fail that test? Because it's an element. It's not the whole thing, but it's an element. And similarly, anybody that aspires to leadership going forward is absolutely going to have to learn that world, or they're going to sound like the people in my time who said, I never watched TV. Right? Because everybody else.
And be dismissed without realizing it further. Now, we are basically out of time. I have one last question, which is a thread that's actually come up in a number of, I mean, because the 3 previous guests were all elected representatives, this question came up almost indirectly, and I'm not sure that they were comfortable enough to answer it directly, but because you're not, I'm curious to get your thoughts. For young people, electoral reform seems to be a really big issue, both in terms of increasing opportunities for participation and in some cases perceiving that political parties are not going to give them the types of opportunities as quickly as they might want to do them, in the sense that I suspect many young people are not interested in stuffing envelopes as an entry-level political position. So my question is, as a communicator, as a political communicator, what do you think is necessary or would be required for there to be electoral reform in Canada? Is it impossible? Is it something that may never happen under the existing circumstances? And I raise it because I do see it tied to technology, that if technology is distributing centers of authority, if it's breaking monopolies of knowledge, then it suggests that there are new political parties that will take advantage of these new modalities if the existing do not. And in some cases, it appears like they're not. Do you see electoral reform as a possibility? And if so, what would it take on a communications level for it to get to a point in the public discourse that it would be taken seriously, rather than its current state, which is regularly marginalized?
Well, if I was 20 instead of almost 65, this is the one I would get behind. Because there's an absolute core problem in the country. And the core problem to me is we have a political structure that defines community geographically and we no longer define ourselves geographically as a community. And that has to be addressed. There is no prospect that, I mean, for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, you know, pretty typically, you know, people stayed in certain geographies, they stayed in certain communities. You know, you were kind of born somewhere, you worked there, you raised a family there, or you didn't, but you know, and if you moved, you maybe moved one riding over, but that was like the dark side of the moon, right? That is not our collective experience, right? And as the economy gets less structured, we are all going to have to be kind of economic nomads, or we are already, right? Like the day of, we'd all go sign on to General Motors in Oshawa, you know, be there 30 years, get a gold watch, live in Oshawa. That's not happening. We're all moving all the time. And so we need another way to express a community. And so if you had proportional representation, for instance, you would not have a circumstance where you know, the Greens, for instance, you know, are kind of reduced to a single geography, right? If there was proportional representation, there would be a Green representation in the House, probably, just in terms of popular vote. There would be more incentive for people to vote, because at present, you know, and I say this with some admiration, I live in Trinity Spadina, our MP is Olivia Chow. She's an outstanding member of Parliament, right? If you're not a New Democrat, you know, maybe you, and it's late, you know, you got an errand or two to run, maybe you don't go out to vote because you kind of think she's going to win, and right? But if there was something else, that maybe you would. No, I'm not suggesting this is going to have like some huge leap, but a percent or two would matter, you know? Young people feeling that they could participate and in a way that they kind of allowed that to be expressed, that would matter. And I believe the political class understands that has to happen. The problem is you do have a framework around a constitution. I know I've got the scar tissue to show what happens when you open the constitutional file. You know, you do so at your peril. And the problem will be everybody will want their issue resolved in the first round, right? That we won't be patient enough to an incrementalist thing. So where I'd net out, in communication terms, is I'd pick one idea, I'd pick one thing. It would probably be around proportional representation, and I would try to drive that one change. Because the parties then, it's about, you know, where's the common interest, right? And a political party can get its head around that could be in their interest, right? Because the first past the post system, you know, back in the day, Mr. Trudeau used to win 75 out of, or 74 out of 75 in Quebec, right? The Tories would get 20-some% of the vote, no seats, or one. You know, Rocky LaSalle, you were Grafty, right? 2. That was it, right? Similarly, Liberals in Alberta, nothing. Okay? In the last federal election, the New Democratic Party got shut out in terms of seats in the cradle of the movement in Saskatchewan, right? That doesn't reflect the strength of the party in Saskatchewan. So because they probably can be convinced that there's an interest for them in it, then then once you affect that change, then it's got broader implications, and that's where I'd go. And I would just hammer at it, and I'd hammer at it. And the other thing I'd do, frankly, I wouldn't, you see, if I was looking at Robocon, I wouldn't be asking for a public inquiry. I'd be in another place. I'd be asking for a Royal Commission on Electoral Reform. I would argue that there hasn't been one since Pierre Lortie in 1993. I would argue that the technology has completely changed the landscape. I wouldn't be pointing fingers. I'd just say, you know what, we're due. And the Royal Commission has been a policy instrument of choice in this country through its history. Some of the very best things about this country are the direct consequence of Royal Commissions. I don't know I don't know who'd say no, right? I can see why somebody would say no to a public inquiry. Harder to say no to a Royal Commission. That's what I'd push. And then I'd get behind it.
Well, I think this has been an excellent session, and I'd like everyone to please show your appreciation.